Cowboy followed Apache into the storm, and one forgotten name changed everything tonight. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jack Thomas had lived a quiet life for many years. A cowboy, rugged and solitary, his days were spent under the hot sun, tending to his cattle on his isolated ranch. He had once been part of a community, part of a world filled with people and noise, but now he was alone. The land was his only companion, the wind his only conversation. Jack had buried his past, buried it deep, hoping it would never surface again. But life has a way of reminding you of what you try to forget, and tonight was one of those reminders. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of orange and purple, a storm began to roll in. The wind howled through the trees, and the first drops of rain splattered against the dry earth. Jack had seen many storms in his time, but this one felt different. It wasn't just the rain or the wind, it was something in the air, something that made his skin crawl. And that's when he saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, a figure shrouded in the mist, her silhouette barely visible against the growing darkness. It was Ayanna Redfeather, a woman he had never seen before, but one whose presence sent a shock through his chest. She was Apache, a people Jack had always avoided. His father had taught him to stay away from them, to trust no one with dark skin and strange ways. But here she was, standing in front of him, soaked to the bone, her eyes pleading for help. Jack hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn away, to leave her to the storm. But something about her, something about the look in her eyes, made him move. He grabbed his coat and approached her. "You need shelter," he said, his voice rough. "From disuse." She nodded, her face expressionless, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of relief. As he led her to his cabin, the storm grew fiercer, the wind now a violent force pushing against them. Jack could feel the tension between them, the weight of history hanging in the air. He didn't know why he was helping her. Maybe it was just the storm, maybe it was the unspoken plea in her eyes, but he did it anyway. They reached the cabin, and Jack quickly closed the door behind them, shutting out the fury of the storm. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only light in the room. Ayanna sat down, wrapping her arms around herself to ward off the cold. Jack watched her for a moment, trying to make sense of the situation. She was Apache. She had no business being here. But the storm didn't care about such things. It had brought her to him, and now they were both trapped together, facing the same unpredictable force of nature. He sat across from her, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. He wanted to ask her why she was out there in the storm, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just stared into the fire, the flames dancing like memories he couldn't shake. Ayanna broke the silence first, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you," she said, her gaze meeting his. "You didn't have to help me." Jack didn't know what to say to that. He had helped her because it was the right thing to do, but in his world, right and wrong weren't always so clear. As the storm raged outside, something shifted in the room. Jack felt a connection, something unspoken but undeniable. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing: human connection. Ayanna too seemed to sense it. She looked at him, not with the suspicion he had expected, but with a kind of quiet understanding. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was something deeper. But whatever it was the beginning of something Jack couldn't have predicted. A forgotten name, a name that had been buried in the past, would change everything tonight. The storm continued to howl outside, the wind pushing against the walls of the cabin, as Jack sat across from Ayanna. He could feel the weight of the silence between them, thick and uncomfortable. He didn't know why he had brought her in from the storm. Maybe it was just the desperation in her eyes. Or maybe it was the memory of his own lonely existence that made him want to reach out. But whatever it was it felt like the right thing to do. Ayana sat quietly, her eyes flicking to the fire, her face reflecting the glow of the flames. She didn't speak at first, and Jack wasn't sure if she was just exhausted or if she was waiting for him to say something. He wasn't good with words, never had been. He had always let the land speak for him, let his work be his voice. But tonight, with her sitting in his cabin, everything felt different. Ayana finally broke the silence, her voice low and steady. "I'm not sure why I'm here," she said softly, almost to herself. Jack's gaze shifted to her, his heart tightening at her words. "You don't have to explain," he said, his voice rough. "I don't need to know." She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as though she was trying to figure him out. "But you do," she said. "You should know." Jack felt his stomach churn at her words. What did she mean by that? What was he supposed to know? "I don't think it matters," Jack said, standing up and walking over to the window. The storm outside was still raging, but he could see the flickering light of distant campfires, probably from a passing caravan or a small group of travelers. He could feel Ayana's eyes on him, and he turned back to face her. She was studying him, her brow furrowed slightly, as if she was trying to read his thoughts. "You have your own demons," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." Jack stiffened, but didn't respond. He wasn't ready to talk about his past, not with her, not with anyone. It was a part of him he had buried long ago, something he didn't want to dredge up. But Ayana wasn't letting it go. She stood up and walked over to where Jack was standing, her steps quiet on the wooden floor. "You're not alone, you know," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself." Jack turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to hear this, didn't want to hear about how he was supposed to open up, supposed to share his pain. He had learned long ago that keeping things to himself was the only way to survive. But Ayana's words struck a chord inside him, something deep, something that had been buried for years. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like someone understood. He didn't know what to do with that feeling, but he couldn't ignore it. He looked at Ayana, really looked at her for the first time. She wasn't just some Apache woman who had wandered into his life by accident. She was someone who, in some strange way, could relate to his pain. Maybe even share it. Jack took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. He could feel the weight of everything, his past, his guilt, his loneliness, bearing down on him. But something about Ayana's presence made it feel just a little easier to bear. "I don't want to talk about it," Jack said quietly. "Not yet. But I'm glad you're here." Ayana smiled faintly, and Jack felt a small relief wash over him. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, for the first time in years, there was a sense of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always thought. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the cabin as the storm outside raged on. Jack sat in his usual spot by the window, staring out into the night, but his thoughts were far away. Ayana was asleep on the cot across the room, her breathing steady and calm. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a moment of peace, a reprieve from the chaos of his own mind. Jack didn't know how long they had been sitting in silence, but it was long enough for him to finally face the thoughts he had been running from. He could feel the weight of his past, the guilt, the loneliness, and the pain, but somehow, tonight, it didn't seem so heavy. Maybe it was because Ayana had been there, maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he had allowed himself to be close to someone. The storm outside picked up again, the wind howling through the trees, but inside the cabin, it felt like a world apart. Jack finally stood up, stretching his legs, and walked over to the fire. He stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker, his mind spinning with thoughts he didn't know how to put into words. He had helped Ayana, yes, but in doing so, he had also helped himself in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about saving her, it was about confronting his own demons, about accepting that he didn't have to carry everything alone. Ayana stirred from the cot, her eyes fluttering open as she sat up slowly. Jack turned to look at her, but said nothing. She didn't speak either. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and unblinking. "You're thinking too much," she said softly. Jack blinked, caught off guard by the simple truth of her words. "I've always done that," he replied, his voice rough. Ayana smiled faintly, but there was no judgment in her expression, just understanding. "You don't have to carry it all," she said. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself." Her words lingered in the air between them, settling into the space like something profound. Jack felt his chest tighten as he realized how true they were. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of his past alone. Maybe he didn't have to face it all by himself. Ayana stood up then, walking over to where Jack was standing. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and he didn't pull away. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist. It was just the two of them, standing in the warmth of the firelight. "You've already done more than you realize," she said quietly. Jack's heart beat a little faster at her words. He wanted to say something, to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just nodded, feeling something stir inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The storm outside began to quiet, the wind dying down as the night stretched on. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Jack and Ayana stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but somehow, together. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack didn't feel so alone. The morning light slowly began to creep through the cracks in the wooden walls of the cabin, casting a soft glow across the room. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness in the air that felt almost unnatural. Jack stood by the window, looking out over the land. The fields were damp, the earth dark from the rain, but the sun was starting to shine through, promising a new day. It was the kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. But as he stood there, looking out at the world, he realized that peace wasn't something that came without change. Ayana had changed something in him, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. He had spent so many years running from his past, burying his feelings deep inside, thinking that if he ignored them long enough, they would disappear. But now, with Ayana here, he was starting to see things differently. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of everything on his shoulders alone. He could feel her presence in the room, even before she spoke. "Jack?" Ayana's voice was soft but steady. He turned around to see her standing in the doorway, her dark hair falling around her shoulders, her expression calm but watchful. "I've been thinking," she continued, stepping into the room, "about what you said last night. About carrying everything by yourself." Jack swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He wasn't sure how to respond, but he knew he had to say something. "It's hard," he finally muttered. "It's hard to let go of everything, to not feel like I have to be the one to fix things." Ayana nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I know," she said quietly. "But you don't have to fix everything. Sometimes the best way to heal is to let others in." Jack looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they had met. There was something in her that he hadn't seen before: strength, yes, but also vulnerability. She had her own scars, her own battles. She wasn't just the strong Apache woman who had come into his life out of nowhere. She was a person with her own pain, her own story. And for some reason, Jack felt like he could trust her with his. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening as he spoke. "I don't know how to do that. To let go, I mean." Ayana walked over to him, her steps light on the wooden floor. She reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm, her touch grounding him. "It's not easy," she said softly. "But it's the only way. You have to trust that the people around you won't judge you for your past. They'll accept you, scars and all." Jack's heart pounded in his chest as her words sank in. He had spent so much of his life thinking that his past was something to hide, something that made him unworthy of connection. But Ayana was telling him otherwise. For the first time, he felt the walls he had built around himself start to crumble, just a little. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let everything go, but for the first time, he was willing to try. He met her gaze, his eyes softening. "I'm not sure I know how to trust anyone," he said quietly. Ayana smiled, a small but knowing smile. "It's a process. But I'll be here, Jack. Whenever you're ready." The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, a space where they didn't need to say anything more. Jack felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just peace, it was the possibility of something new. He wasn't alone. And for the first time, that didn't scare him. The morning light grew brighter, filling the cabin with warmth. And Jack, standing next to Ayana, felt like maybe, just maybe, he was ready to face whatever came next. The next few days passed slowly, the kind of quiet Jack had always preferred. The storm had left behind a clear, cool sky, and the land around his cabin looked peaceful again. But something inside Jack had shifted, something he hadn't expected. Ayana had given him a glimpse of what it might be like to let go of the weight he had carried for so long. She had shown him that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry it alone. Still, Jack wasn't sure how to move forward. He didn't know what to do with this new feeling, this feeling that had been buried so deep inside him for so long that it was almost foreign. It was vulnerability. The ability to open up, to trust. Something he had spent his entire life avoiding. Ayana had been kind to him, patient even, and he didn't know how to repay that. She had seen past the walls he had put up, the walls he had built to protect himself from the pain of his past. She had done what no one else had been able to do, she had made him feel seen. And he was afraid. Afraid that once he let his guard down completely, it would all come crashing down. But Ayana never pressured him. She just kept being there. She helped him around the ranch, sometimes silently, sometimes with a quiet word here and there. And little by little, the tension between them began to ease. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayana spoke up. "You're not the only one with a past," she said, her voice soft but steady. Jack looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" She looked into the fire, her dark eyes distant for a moment. "I have my own demons," she said quietly. "I've lost things too. People I loved. People I trusted. It's hard to carry that, but sometimes you have to let it go. Or it will consume you." Jack felt a pang in his chest as her words resonated with him. He had never imagined that Ayana, with her strength and resolve, could have her own burdens to bear. He had only seen her as the woman who had wandered into his life, who needed help. But now, he saw her in a new light. She wasn't just a stranger. She was someone who had her own scars, her own grief. And maybe that was why she understood him in ways no one else could. "How do you let go?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. Ayana turned her gaze to him then, her eyes steady and kind. "You don't forget," she said softly. "You learn to live with it. To accept that some things can't be changed, no matter how much you wish they could. And then you make peace with that." Jack looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long trying to outrun his past, trying to bury it deep inside him, thinking that if he ignored it long enough, it would go away. But Ayana was right. It wouldn't go away. It would always be a part of him. The trick was learning to live with it. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think I understand," he said quietly. Ayana smiled then, a gentle, knowing smile. "You will," she said softly. "It takes time, but you will." For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of hope. It wasn't a big, overwhelming feeling. It was more like a quiet realization, a shift in his heart. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't facing it alone. He had Ayana by his side. And that, in itself, felt like a small victory. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the storm outside had passed. The world felt still, peaceful, like a new beginning was waiting just beyond the horizon. Days passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind of rhythm that felt like it was meant to last. Jack woke up early, as he always did, and made his way to the stables. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting soft light over the land. Ayanna had taken to helping him with the chores around the ranch, and for the first time in a long time, Jack found himself looking forward to the day ahead. He didn't know what had changed exactly. Maybe it was the sense of peace Ayanna brought with her, or maybe it was the simple fact that, after all these years of living alone, he wasn't alone anymore. Ayanna was there, not just physically, but in a way that felt like she understood him. The land, the work, everything felt different now. One morning, as they worked together, Ayanna looked over at Jack and smiled, the sun glinting off her hair. "You're starting to look like you're at peace," she said. Jack stopped for a moment, his hands on the fence, looking out at the cattle. "I never thought I'd get there," he said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of things left unsaid. Ayanna didn't push. She just let the silence settle between them, a comfortable quiet that felt like a change in the air. Jack didn't know how to explain it, but something was different. He felt lighter, not because the weight of the past was gone, but because he wasn't trying to carry it alone anymore. As the days went by, Jack found himself trusting Ayanna in ways he hadn't expected. He didn't talk much about his past, but every now and then, something would come up, and he would find himself sharing more than he ever had with anyone. She never judged him. She just listened. And Jack realized that listening was all he needed. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jack looked over at Ayanna, his thoughts racing. He had never been good with words, but something inside him needed to say this. "I'm not sure I ever thanked you," he said, his voice low. "For what?" Ayanna asked, her gaze steady. "For helping me. For being here. I didn't expect this, didn't expect any of this," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. Ayanna smiled, her eyes softening. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "You saved me too." Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her not just as the woman who had walked into his life, but as someone who had her own struggles, her own losses. "You don't have to carry everything either," Ayanna added, her voice gentle but firm. Jack nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he could face it. With Ayanna by his side, maybe he didn't have to do it all alone. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the weight of their shared moments settling into the quiet. Jack didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need to. He had learned, in these last few days, that it was enough to take things one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like progress. The world outside was vast, full of uncertainty, but inside the cabin, in that moment, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where he belonged. The days grew warmer as spring settled over the land, the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers filling the air. Jack found himself waking earlier each morning, the rhythm of the ranch now a part of him, as natural as the sun rising in the east. Ayanna was always by his side, moving with a quiet confidence as they worked together, fixing fences and tending to the cattle. There was no hurry anymore. No need to race against time. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he was living, not just surviving. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, the air thick with the warmth of the sun, Ayanna spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Jack," she said, "there's something I need to tell you." Jack turned to her, his curiosity piqued. He had grown to trust Ayanna more than he had trusted anyone in a long time. She had become more than just a companion, she had become someone he could rely on, someone who had shown him what it meant to truly let go of the past. "What is it?" he asked, his tone gentle. Ayanna took a deep breath, her gaze distant for a moment as though she was weighing her words. "I've been thinking a lot," she continued, "about my tribe. About my people. I've been away from them for so long, and I've realized that I need to go back. I need to help them." Jack's heart sank at her words, though he didn't show it. He had known, deep down, that this day would come. Ayanna had her own life, her own path to follow. He had no right to hold her here, but the thought of losing her, of watching her walk away, brought a tightness to his chest. I understand, Jack said, his voice steady, though his emotions were anything but. I knew this day would come. Ayana turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. You don't have to understand. But you do need to know that this is something I have to do. My people need me. And I can't ignore that. Jack nodded slowly, trying to push back the lump in his throat. He didn't want to say goodbye. He didn't want to face the possibility of losing the only person who had made him feel like he mattered again. I've always admired your strength, Jack said quietly. But I never thought I'd see the day when you had to leave. You've become part of this place, part of my life. Ayana reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. You've become part of my life too, Jack. But my journey isn't finished here. I have to return to my people, to where I belong. Jack swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of pride and sorrow. He had never expected to care so deeply for someone, let alone for someone like Ayana, whose life was so different from his own. But here they were, at this crossroads, where the paths ahead seemed to pull them in different directions. I'll miss you, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. Ayana's gaze softened, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. You don't have to miss me, she said quietly. I'll carry a part of you with me, always. They sat together in silence, the weight of her words settling between them. Jack didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had truly lived in the moment. And that was enough. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the landscape, and Jack found himself at peace, knowing that sometimes, letting go was the bravest thing you could do. The next few days were filled with a quiet heaviness, as if the land itself had become aware of the change that was coming. Jack spent his mornings tending to the cattle, his movements automatic, the familiar tasks no longer providing the comfort they once did. Ayana had said she needed to leave, and even though he had expected it, the reality of her departure made everything feel uncertain. He couldn't shake the feeling that a chapter of his life was ending, and with it, something he had never truly acknowledged was being taken away. Ayana had packed her things in silence, her movements swift but graceful. She wasn't a woman who needed much, and that was something Jack had always admired. She was independent, strong, yet when she was with him, she had softened in a way that Jack hadn't expected. The day before she was to leave, Jack stood by the barn, his hands resting on the wooden fence, as he watched the sun dip below the horizon. Ayana came to stand beside him, her presence quiet but strong. Either of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a moment where words didn't need to fill the space. I'll miss you, Jack finally said, his voice low and rough. Ayana turned her head to look at him, her eyes steady but soft. And I'll miss you, she replied. But this is something I have to do, Jack. Jack nodded, his throat tightening with the words he couldn't quite say. He had grown so used to her presence, so accustomed to the idea that they were partners in this quiet life. He had never imagined that something so simple, so peaceful, could make him feel so vulnerable. He wasn't ready to let her go. But he knew she had to. She had a life to return to, a purpose beyond the boundaries of his ranch. He didn't want to hold her back, but the thought of her leaving made his chest ache. You've taught me a lot, Jack said, his voice thick. More than I ever thought I needed to learn. Ayana smiled, her expression softening. I've learned from you too, she said. There's more to life than just survival, Jack. You've shown me that. They stood in silence again, the air around them still, the evening sky turning a deep shade of purple. Jack wasn't sure how much longer they would have this moment, but he wanted to hold on to it for as long as he could. Ayana stepped forward then, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture that felt more like a promise than anything else. You'll be all right, Jack, she said softly. You don't have to carry everything alone. Jack looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But with Ayana's words, he realized that maybe it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was just about learning to trust, to let go of the things that held him back. Take care of yourself, Iana, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, the kind of smile that made his heart feel lighter. You too, Jack. You too. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Jack watched her leave. She mounted her horse with a quiet grace, her silhouette outlined against the light of the new day. She didn't look back, but Jack didn't expect her to. She had already given him everything he needed. As the sound of her horse's hooves faded into the distance, Jack stood there for a long time, the weight of her absence settling around him. The world felt different now, but in a way, it felt right. Iana had left, but the lessons she had taught him would stay with him forever. Weeks passed since Iana had left, and the ranch felt quieter, emptier. Jack woke each morning with the same routine, tending to the cattle, checking the fences, and fixing what needed to be fixed. The world around him was unchanged, but he felt it, this subtle shift inside, a feeling of something missing. The land still held its beauty, the vast skies and rolling fields of green, but Jack had become acutely aware of the silence that accompanied it. He had always been alone, but now, even with the work to keep him busy, he could feel the absence of the woman who had once shared his space. He missed the sound of her voice, the way she had quietly understood him without him ever having to explain. Iana's words echoed in his mind, the ones about not having to carry everything alone. He didn't realize how much he had needed that reminder until she was gone. As the days went by, Jack found himself standing at the edge of the ranch, staring out at the horizon, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. It wasn't the same anymore. He was trying to make peace with it, to understand that Iana had her own path to follow, but it was harder than he had imagined. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack sat on the porch, the familiar creak of the rocking chair beneath him. He gazed out at the setting sun, the sky streaked with oranges and purples, and felt a deep, aching emptiness. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, maybe just a sign that it would get easier. Maybe he was hoping that the world would return to the way it was before, when everything had felt simpler. But life had a way of changing, of moving forward, whether you were ready for it or not. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. Jack looked up, squinting into the fading light. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a familiar figure riding towards him. It was Iana. His breath caught in his throat as she rode closer, her silhouette outlined against the dimming sky. She dismounted gracefully, her movements as fluid as he remembered. Jack stood up, his mind racing with 1,000 questions, but all he could manage was a simple Iana. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, one that made Jack's heart settle in his chest. I had to come back, she said softly, her voice like a familiar melody. I couldn't stay away. Not for long. Jack felt a mix of relief and confusion wash over him. But you left, he said, his voice strained. I thought. Iana shook her head, her eyes bright with sincerity. I needed to go back. But I realized something. My journey isn't complete without this. Without you. And I couldn't stay away, Jack. Jack stood still for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't know what to say, didn't know if he had the words to express the rush of emotions inside him. But Iana didn't need him to say anything. She simply stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his arm. I've made my peace, she said quietly. I'm ready now. To be here. With you. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them standing together under the fading light of the evening. Jack felt something shift inside him, a realization that maybe, just maybe, they could both find a place in this world, together. The sky darkened above them, but it no longer felt like a cold, empty night. It felt like a new beginning, one that neither of them had expected, but one they were both ready to embrace. Jack didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. With Iana by his side, they were ready to face whatever came next.